A compound path is defined as where a hole appears where the two objects overlap. So Illustrator defines them as one object. I want to show you both in layers and on the artboard what happens when we create a compound path. So right now I have a background box that's a light colored blue, and if you look on layers you can see this is locked. I have then a purple circle, and on top of that circle I have smaller circles that have a yellowish tint to them. So I'm going to unlock this background because I want this to be a color that's extremely noticeable, that we can see through it when we create our compound paths. So I'm going to go to the swatches and let's just choose a brighter color. Let's choose an orange. Okay. So I'm going to do a couple of different demonstrations here. The first one I'm going to do with just one of the smaller circles. So I'm going to click the smaller circle, shift and click the larger circle. Okay, I'm clicking with my selection tool, so now I have two objects selected. When we deal with compound paths, we have to have at least two. We can have more than two, and I'll show you that in a moment. So now that I have two objects selected, what I'm going to do is go to Object Menu, go down to Compound Path, and Make. Alright, so I wanted you to see both on the artboard what happens. So I do have a hole. And if I drag this over, you can see that it's a hole cut through my blue circle. And if you look in the Layers panel, you can see it actually lists it as compound path. Now Illustrator thinks this is one object. So that overlapping smaller circle or smaller object there made a hole. It functions as a transparent whole. So this whole thing is sort of a group. Okay. Now this overlapping object still does exist, and I can get to it if I use my direct selection tool. So I can select directly, and I'm going to grab this little tiny, once I see the little X for the center point, I can try to click it. Sometimes you need to get on the edges there. So I have now my object, selected. Let's go ahead and lock this background so we don't mistakenly get it. So with the direct selection tool, here it is. I can make sure I have all of my points. I'm just going to shift click all four corners here. And so now I can move it. I'll use my arrow keys. Okay, and what happens when you leave the outside edge of your object, it does sort of an inverse. So it's only where they overlap where we see this transparency. Okay, I'm not able to change the appearance or any kind of attributes of these pieces within the compound path independently. They act as though they're one shape. Okay, so now I can also release this. If I want this to be returned back to individual objects, I can release it. So with it selected, I'm going to go back to the same place where I created it, but this time release it. When I release it, what happens, it did release it. Again, it's a good idea to watch layers in your layers panel. I released it. Both objects are selected at the moment, but it plays a little bit with the coloring and the stacking order. So if I turn off this, there you can see it doesn't remember the original attributes, so it just puts the attributes of what it was as a compound path, if that makes sense. Okay, this time I'm going to do something a bit different, and I'm going to select, and I'm using my layers because I can't really see where this is at, so I'm going to select it in layers. Let's just color it a bright color so we can see it. And this time I'm going to shift click to get each one of these circles. And if I wanted to, I could apply a scale to these to make them a little bit larger. So let's scale it, let's say 120, let's go quite a bit. 180%. That way they're actually sticking off, and you're going to see an interesting effect happen here. So with my selection tool, I'm going to go ahead and shift click to get my center. I could go over to layers and click each one of these little targets, holding down my shift key to add. That would allow me to select multiple objects as well, if that's an easier method. And again, go under Object, and compound path and make. So here I can see what happened is that the overlapping areas became transparent, and where they were not overlapping acts as though it's just part of the original object. So objects on the top become holes for the objects below. That's a compound path.